Okay, so any Zoomers, if you can hear me, give a thumbs up and okay, sounds like
Yes.
it's good. Okay, well, thanks all for the opportunity to speak. The Native Plant Society was key in my early native plant education. So I was born here, or, I'm sorry, I wasn't born here. I was born in LA, but moved here when I was 3. And none of my family was from the Southwest, so we had no oral history to this place. I was surrounded by all these plants that I was playing with, but I didn't know the names of them. So I got more into that later in life, and the Native Plant Society was key in a lot of my education. Um, I like to start this talk by asking, have any of you ever experienced a true living oasis? Because I'm sure you've experienced oases, but a true one. And the reason I'm emphasizing that true part is I've experienced many oases which I don't find to be true. Um, I think they're more artificial because they're requiring a lot to be imported, be it water, be it nutrients, be it care. So I'm always far more inspired by what I see as a true living oasis, which is this thriving pocket of life that is thriving just on what's freely at hand right there. Nothing's being imported. There's no electrical cord to anything or a water line. So if you've experienced such a thing, what was it like for you? And did you perhaps, what did it enable in you in its surroundings? And did you have a role in it? And if you did have a role, what was that? So as just maybe thinking about that, I think we're so lucky to be here in the Sonoran Desert, which I've never felt as a desert. It just when I compare it to drier deserts, be it the Mojave or the Chihuahuan deserts on either side of us, thanks to our 2 rainy seasons. But when along with my brother, moved to the Dunbar Spring neighborhood in 1994, the top image is what things look like. And in the public right-of-way, it was pretty hot, exposed, and bleak. And we didn't really want to hang out there half the year because it was so hot. So talked to a bunch of the neighbors and asked, hey, what do we want as a community? And a lot of the folks said, well, we'd love to have more community interaction. Uh, why don't we get more trees? And then I heard a story from Willie Fears, one of the elders. She as a kid, went to the Dunbar School, and she said she could walk barefoot in the middle of summer from our neighborhood to downtown and back. I thought, that's crazy. You must have the hardiest feet in the world. There's no way I could do that. And she said, well, it used to be tree-lined street all the way to downtown and back. And so there's none of those trees were in existence when I moved to the neighborhood. So I looked at a bunch of historical photos and whatnot and of the neighborhood, and it seems that they were most likely Chinaberry trees or the like. But they weren't native trees. They were exotics and more prone to die out if they weren't cared for so regularly or watered so regularly. Um, so um, After one of the neighborhood meetings, when people were saying we should have a tree planting, they said, well, who's going to spearhead that? Back then, I was a lot younger, and I thought, I will spearhead that. But wasn't totally sure how I was going to go about it. But when I learned of Willie Spear's story, and then when I learned that there had been a tree planting project in the 1980s that had planted over 100 trees, but the majority were South American hybrid mesquites. And when I went through the neighborhood looking for them, I could only find a dozen that remained from that original planting. So I talked to neighbors and they said, well, the majority blew over. Um, so, uh, and I don't know if that was partly the way they were planted at the time. We thought, well, how could we do better? And we thought, well, out in the desert, everything seems to be thriving just fine without care. So we decided to take our cues from the desert. But we went further than that. We didn't just plant native vegetation as opposed to the exotic trees. We wanted to plant in a way that we would be giving back more water to the aquifer than we took from it. So we didn't want to be dependent on groundwater irrigation beyond the 1 to 3 years of establishment. We decided to plant the rain as we planted the vegetation. So we went from that to that in about 10 years. And I'll give you more of that story as we go along here. And what we've been striving for all along is for these neighborhood-wide plantings to be a true oasis, a beneficial ruin, with the goal that we can abandon this because we're all going to die at some point. This will continue to thrive without us and evolve. So planting the rain, that's the first thing. So when we started, and we get volunteers to plant in our annual rain and tree planting project, our basins were only about 3-foot diameter around the 5-gallon trees. We'd only plant 5-gallon size trees, no larger, because we found they were much quicker to get established than, say, a 15-gallon or a larger size tree. The tree holes were a lot easier to dig too. That's essential in working with community volunteers. Okay. And then we also found in the lower right image, you can see there's this little hole in the wall. There's a parking lot on the other side. Water flows after a storm through that hole over the asphalt. And in the crack, there was a little mesquite growing. We thought, well, that's some pretty awesome inspiration. And why don't we enlarge that crack? So we started busting rain holes rather than potholes within the asphalt anywhere we saw there being accumulation of runoff, and started doing guerrilla planting. And that's been very successful. And we found that it's essential to get maximum efficiency to plant the rain and then plant the vegetation where you've got additional rainfall in the form of stormwater runoff. So in the lower left here, we can see get a good sized tree and some understory plants if we plant within or beside a rainwater harvesting basin or rain garden that retains rather than drains that stormwater. But we do even better in the middle image if we're not just capturing direct rainfall, but also the runoff from a similarly sized catchment area, similarly sized to the planting area, then we can double the available rainfall. That water could be coming off a roof, or it could be coming off a roof and or pathway, driveway, patio. And in that instance, where we've got 2 catchment areas, about the same as the planting area, we're able to triple the available rainfall. So you can make more rain available even though no more rain's falling from the sky, as long as you're directing the runoff to where you want it. And the other key thing is you adequately size those rain gardens. When we originally did those 3-foot diameter, 6-inch deep basins, wholly inadequate. Okay, it was great to get the 5-gallon trees established, but once the trees started getting larger, its water demand's increasing, it was wholly undersized. So we've changed that. Now, when we started our work, we didn't change any physical infrastructure of the public infrastructure, such as asphalt or the concrete curb. So this upper image, you can see how the water is flowing off the roof, then past the 20-foot wide public right-of-way and into the street. And there's also stormwater flowing down the street, but past these plants. So we would do little neighborhood retrofits where we started digging basins, where in the upper left we delineated with the just a scuff mark in the dirt where we wanted the basin boundary to be. The dirt we dug out of the basins, we put onto the raised paths. And then in the lower right image, you see now we've reversed the draining topography to a water retaining topography. And let's see, make sure I hit the right button. Yep. So now we're capturing stormwater from the street, and we're capturing the water from the roof. So free water, okay? One of the things I heard from older neighbors about some failed tree planting attempts in the past is they said people didn't like watering. So, you know, after the first month or so, they got bored and they just stopped, and then tree perished. So we wanted to make it as easy as possible for the plants to get the water they need. Within people's yards on the properties, we wanted to reverse what we saw as a dysfunctional topography. In the upper left, you can see where maybe folks had turf, like in here, and surplus water drains to the pathway and then to the street. So a potential solution to reducing the water needs of turf is to, in the lower left image, replace the turf with more arid adapted plants. But if you don't change the dysfunctional topography that's draining the storm water and any surplus irrigation water to the pathway in the street, I think we're still missing the boat. There's a lot of programs out there like Cash for Grass to remove turf. I don't think they work, and I found from colleagues in LA they don't work if they don't change the underlying water draining topography. So on the right-hand side is what we're advocating for, is to plant within or beside more basin shapes that capture the runoff that becomes run-on and then soak in, which is right on. So this way we're maximizing the free waters. So not only capturing rain and runoff, but we can also, in times of no rain, direct our household gray water via gravity with sloped pipes draining into these same areas. So our secondary water source in times of no rain becomes that gray water. Okay, so along the street where we started our plantings, we focused the bulk of our plantings in the public right-of-way because most of our residents are renters, not owners. And so we want this effort to be available for everybody to enjoy, not just those that have access to private yards. So we saw in the early years after we had planted in these 3-foot diameter basins that the bulk of the water was flowing down the street in the street gutter past our little 3-foot diameter basins. We're like, man, we missed the boat. So we started widening the basins out, deepening the basins, and making them deeper than the street gutter, so we could direct street runoff into the street side basins. We have still broken no laws. That's coming. Okay, so we have not changed any hard infrastructure. So we would place these where there was a dip in the curb, where there still was, or in the past was, a driveway. And then we just brought the basins out to that. Here's an illustration representing the same thing. There's the old driveway area, there's the dip, and then we went to this long linear basin. That worked really well. And then in another little dip, we used to have a 1-car garage that the water would drain from the street through the garage out the back door and flood the neighbor's yard. That wasn't working. So we made a little earth berm here, so the water wouldn't flow in. This is an undersized berm. These are the early experiments, learned from successes as well as failures. But you look at all that pooled water. So we just threw some seed in there, planted. Here's an early planting. For those of you on Zoom, I'm looking at the middle left-hand image. There's a little tree beside the curb and the Volkswagen truck. That's the 3-foot diameter basin, okay, before we started enlarging. Then you can see the amount of growth that grew. Our neighbors perhaps weren't into it in the early days, but we let anything that would grow live. And then if it was an invasive weed, we would cut it down before it seeded or flowered and seeded, but we wanted all that organic matter to enhance the soil. And then on the right hand, you can see the image in 2023, a couple decades after our 1996 planting in the upper left image. And that's all only irrigated by harvested rainfall and the runoff coming off the street. Okay, so whoops, let me go back. So when we saw how well all this worked, we said, hey, well, we don't have a dip in the curb. We need to have some way of getting the street runoff to street side plantings. So that's when we decided to break the law. So we started cutting the curb where we needed stormwater entry to street side plantings, but didn't currently have entry. And so just a 14-inch gas-powered circular saw, you can get at any rental center with a diamond carbide blade, is the way to go. And I've got step-by-step instructions on my website how to do this as well. The last step after you've made all the cuts is just to hit it with the sledgehammer. That should never be your only step. You don't want to just whack stuff out and make gaping, jagged holes. We want to help improve public infrastructure for everybody, not make it worse. So we did this, and then I was afraid that we were going to get caught, but neighbors would come by. They would see how well our plants were growing, how much faster than theirs, how much healthier they were. And they said, what's the deal? We never see you watering, but your plants are doing better than ours. And then we showed them what we did, and they said, we want to do this. And then we decided, okay, we got to take this to the city because there's too many folks that want to do this now. And it took 3 years after a number of meetings, but we got it legalized. So now it's legalized. You can get a $2,000 rebate, and it's mandated in new road construction and major road renovation, thanks in part to the inspiration that the city got from a guerrilla action. So those curb cuts are expensive if you don't do it yourself, if you hire a contractor, because they usually use more intensive equipment than the circular saw we used. So now we don't do the big curb cuts. We instead do, as you can see in the upper left, curb cores, 4-inch diameter. It's a lot cheaper to do, and it's a lot quicker than the larger curb cut. They are a little more likely to clog with debris that's in the street, so you just got to make sure you get out at the beginning of the rainy season and clean out the debris and visit it again during the rainy season. But it costs about $350 per hour for the crew to show up and do this. But if you've already collaborated with a bunch of your neighbors and you have multiple sites and you give them a list of the sites that are all in order so they don't have to zigzag, they just drive in one continuous direction, you can get them to do 8, 12 or more curb cores in an hour. So we try and get a lot of neighbors together to have that ready. So this is a value and a key to working as a community. Instead of just doing one-off installations where we'd be paying $350 per curb core, we can get the price down to $75 or $50 per curb core, depending on how many we're doing that year. Okay. We also, as you can see in the lower left image, we are cutting into the gutter itself, and we're cutting at an angle going down and somewhat in the flow. It's not just perpendicular to the street, okay? So all that helps make for a more efficient flow. And Henry Jacobson back here, he's created another option called the curb slice, which he can tell you about. And they both work real well. So when we did all this, another little innovation we did is we made sure we would always put the curb cut or the curb core on the upstream side of the street side basin, never the downstream side, because that gives us more capacity than if we had the inlet down here. And the inlet is where water backs up to once the whole thing's full. So water does not flow through the system. It doesn't come in one end and out the other. It just fills up, backs up on itself, and the surplus continues down the gutter to the next curb cut. So it's self-maintaining to a large degree. We don't lose mulch. We don't lose soil because water's not flowing through. It's just backing up into it. And we found that on a typical Tucson neighborhood street, there's over 1 million gallons of rain falling on that 1 mile section of neighborhood street. So 1 million gallons per mile on a neighborhood street. So that's an incredible amount of water if we don't just let it flow down the street, but instead direct it to street side or in-street plantings where the basins are sized to handle a large volume of that water. So anyhow, that 1 million gallons per mile, that's more than enough water to have every street in Tucson lined with a continuous shade belt of native shade trees irrigated with nothing more than the runoff off the street, as long as our basins are sized to capture enough of that stormwater. So another innovation is we now have 3 distinct planting zones in every basin: the bottom zone, the terrace zone, and the top zone. I'm going to go back real quick. Whoops, went the wrong way. So I'm trying to show that here too. Bottom, terrace, top. Okay, there's nothing planted on the top here because this is showing the public pathway. But if it weren't a public pathway, we'd be planting there. So we plant the most water tolerant, needy species on the bottom, also the most cold tolerant, because cold air on a cold winter night is going to pool in the low spots. So then we plant our less water tolerant, needy plants on the terrace, and the least water tolerant, needy, and the least cold tolerant plantings on the top. Saguaros never go down here. Okay, they're in the top. So this enables us to plant a greater diversity of species because we have more diversity of microclimates. And the other great thing is this was not anticipated when we did this, but the city requires a railing along a public pathway if you have more than a 13-inch drop next to the pathway. So by creating the planting terrace, you no longer have a 13-inch drop, even if you've got a 13-inch deep basin, because the terrace takes care of that. And if you got a drunk that falls in there, it's a lot easier for him to crawl out thanks to those stairs we just made for him. All right. So then we were so successful working in the street, I'm sorry, alongside the street, we decided to take it into the street. So this is an intersection before we put in the traffic calming traffic circle. This is right after the concrete work was done and it was depaved. You can see how much stormwater it's capturing. Then here's the neighbors planting it. And then the neighbors harvesting the food grown from it. And so we always get a neighborhood planting part of these installations. So people literally are setting roots in this so they feel more invested. We have public art in this. So in a similar way, each individual small sign on the larger crossroads sign is made by a different neighborhood artist. So that's another way to get people involved, to feel part of it, even if they're not into plants, if they're just into the art part. This traffic circle was half the cost of the city's specs of traffic circles. Again, thanks to Henry Jacobson back here, because he created a design where the asphalt was cut exactly where we wanted the concrete curbing to go, and then the contractor used the asphalt as half the formwork. So they only had to create a formwork on the inside of the circle and then trowel it up to that form. So that saved a lot of labor and it saved materials, and they did not have to replace any asphalt because typically the city requires you to over excavate, build 2 forms, put in more concrete, and then replace the asphalt you got rid of. This did not require that, so there's a lot of savings. You can talk to Henry for more info on that. Then in 2009, our neighborhood got a $500,000 Pima County Neighborhood Reinvestment Grant. And we got to decide how we would spend that money. And we decided to spend it in 4 ways: for traffic calming, for tree planting, for water harvesting, and public art. But instead of doing them separately, we decided to integrate them all. So what you see here, this white line, is where we wanted to put in a curb extension. We wanted to bring the curb out to narrow the street and protect on-street parking, because a lot of people drive along the parking lane. But if you have these curb extensions, it keeps them out of that. So there we are. The asphalt's been over excavated. This is the expensive design. And then they put in the formwork, put in the concrete, and they replaced the asphalt. That's the expensive design again. And then you can see all the water that it's collecting, because we've got a 14-inch deep basin in this this chicane or curb extension and the native vegetation. So we're harvesting well over, it's probably about 5,000 to 10,000 gallons a year in each one of these pullouts. All right. And so there's the water harvesting. Here's the tree and other plantings. This is the traffic calming, narrowing the street. And then there are the public arts in the traffic circle there. I'll show you some other examples of that in a moment. So this was a first. The city of Tucson had never done water harvesting traffic calming prior to this. And so it inspired other innovations in the city, such as the Green Streets policy, where now all new city streets need to harvest at minimum a half-inch rainstorm's worth of rainwater in the roadway landscape or the adjoining landscape. Also for all commercial landscapes, the commercial landscapes like where they have a parking lot, they need to provide a minimum 50% of the irrigation needs of that commercial property with passive rainwater harvesting earthworks, such as basins that the parking lot hardscape can direct its water to. Unfortunately, the city still needs to make improvements on the enforcement of this. It's better than it was, but I did an assessment of that ordinance a number of years ago and found that the majority of the sites were failing because the plan was bad or the installation was bad. So such as this. where look, there's a curb cut, but they raise the planting area so it drains all water to the asphalt, not vice versa. This is done right, okay, it's coming the right way, and this could be better. So where the red line in the lower right image is showing you where they could remove more asphalt and make a bigger basin. So it's going in the right direction, but this is where I think it requires more of the public to be calling mayor and council anytime you see a bad installation and saying, hey, let's up the game so there's more political will to keep improving things. There's many ways to see how we could further reduce the overpavement of our communities and look for opportunities for more planting space. So John Geeting did a wonderful blog in Pennsylvania showing how the snow shows the unused asphalt areas of his city. And so he took hundreds of photos like this and gave them to the city. And the city is now depaving many of these areas and replacing them with rain gardens and plantings. Okay. So we wanted to take things even further with our neighborhood plantings. So we pretty much in the public right-of-way only plant Tucson Basin native plants because we're wanting to be most likely to succeed with folks. These are the plants that have adapted over millennia to this climate, soils and wildlife. But we're also always prioritizing the plants that we plant that also have a number of human uses, like edible aspects, medicinal aspects, and so forth. So the cholla cactus, we love that one because it has the edible flower buds. And we typically do the staghorn cholla because it has about 12 different flower colors. So we'll take cuttings of, well, I'll get to that in a sec. Here's my nephew harvesting the flower buds from this street side cholla cactus. And here's one of the native bees, and they sleep in the flowers at night. So the flower closes up at night and tucks them in like a blanket, and then when it opens up in the morning, they reemerge covered in pollen. Okay, so we have hands-on workshops on how to harvest, process, and cook many of these native foods because unfortunately we've lost a lot of that information over time. And but we first brush off the thorns with one of the nearby growing shrubs or understory plants. Then we pick, cook it up, boil it up, dry some, and some we put into cholla bud pico de gallo salsa. Okay. Whenever we have our harvesting workshops, we also always have a planting aspect of the workshop because we don't want it to just be this culture of extraction. So whenever we do the cholla bud harvesting workshops, we are also having people take cuttings of the various cholla cactus in the neighborhood, selecting whatever flower color they want, and then potting that up. And I think this is a great, I don't know, I think it's a good opportunity for plant nurseries to label what color that cholla cactus bloom it has, if people want to go for a certain color. Desert rose, maybe? Okay. All right. So then I want to show that when we had that planting I mentioned in the 80s in our neighborhood, it was the South American hybrid mesquites. So they planted well over 100 trees, but only a dozen remain. Now there's only 8 left in our neighborhood from that original planting. And we found that very often they heave sidewalks and other pavement, and they're very prone to blowing over. So we found the velvet mesquite to be a lot more resilient in the storms, way less blowover and storm damage. But we also found that Janice Bowers found that over 60 different species of native pollinators frequent the velvet mesquite. But we find in the South American hybrid only about 12 by comparison. So if you want that bigger bang for the buck for wildlife habitat, can't beat a native. And I like that book for going more into that story. So here's the Girl Scouts planting a native velvet mesquite tree, a 5-gallon size, back in 1996 Here's the same tree 10 years later, and here's my sister-in-law harvesting the mesquite pods we harvested from that tree. She's also got some screw bean mesquite pods from another tree down the street that we harvested. And via the curb cut, we're getting the free irrigation water coming off the street. So we're also planting baby saguaros. We've got a baby saguaro planting project in the hope that someday, as they become adults, maybe we'll get some more owls living in the neighborhood. I know it's long-term thinking, but that's the hope. But already from the saguaros we planted years ago, we're harvesting saguaro fruit. Okay. And then we've got the native goji berry, the wolfberry that we put in our salads and whatnot. And there's a great many more native foods. With over 400 native food plants in the Sonoran Desert, there's a lot we can choose from. And I want to give a shout out to many of the pioneers and the indigenous peoples of this area. So these are just some of the books that really inspired us in the early years. So when we were making our tree list, we looked to a lot of these books. And in fact, when we started our first tree planting in 1996, I was working with Doug Coppinger at Trees for Tucson. And I said, hey, you don't have a single native tree that you're making available through your program. Could we hack your tree list and as a pilot project, include a few native trees on the Dunbar Spring tree planting list? And he said, sure. So I took that as maybe more of permission than he was giving me. So I hacked the list and removed all trees that weren't Tucson Basin natives. And I didn't add just a few, we added 9. And then we included in the information on the characteristics of the tree, what was edible, medicinal, and so forth. And in that first year, we planted 208 trees. And it was probably the best thing, this is more a community building thing, it was the best thing for me. It may not seem like it as I'm talking to you, but I'm a very shy person. I'm very much an introvert. After this, I'm going to go home and bury myself under the blankets, okay? And I'm not going to want to talk to anyone or see anybody for a good amount of time. So, but I had to go door to door, knocking on the door to meet my neighbors and talk about this tree planting project. And it was the best thing. I met hundreds of neighbors. And even if they didn't want a tree, it was so rewarding because I got to hear some of their stories and vice versa. So as we started planting a lot of these native plants and native food plants, the wildlife taught us even more. So they taught us what are the sweetest mesquite, because every plant is an individual. And so even if on the whole a certain plant tastes good, you might find a very heinous tasting species. So with the velvet mesquite, we pick a pod from the tree, taste it, and if it tastes good, we keep picking. If it doesn't taste good, we spit out the pod and we go to another tree. But the native birds strip the pods of the really good tasting trees. And they start stripping them when they're green. So we would seek them out. And the Wilson's warbler is a great one, cluing us into the nicer trees. And the Tucson Audubon Society has been trying to encourage people to plant more native velvet mesquites, bring in the Wilson warbler because of this little interesting thing. The Wilson warbler, as it's migrating from Central America to Alaska and beyond, it is a small bird, and if it drops into a single native mesquite tree, it can increase its body weight by 10 to 20% in 3 to 4 days, just eating the insects in that single tree. Okay, that's how much life there is in that. So when I heard about that, I was super stoked because like, man, this migratory belt that bird takes, and I'm along that belt, if I can plant some stuff that helps some of those species on that journey, that greatly expands my sense of place. Tucson's much bigger than just this, if you consider the lives moving through it. So as we went along, we learned over time, we said, okay, our basins are still too small. So, and we're starting to experience volunteer planter abuse because people wanted bigger and bigger basins. They wanted to capture more of that water, and they kept pushing we volunteers to dig bigger holes. We're like, come on, you get in here and dig with us. And they wouldn't always get in with us. So we started working with contractors. So now we're able to work with contractors, train them up, and then they can go into other neighborhoods and help them. So our typical basin size now is not 3-foot diameter, but 5-foot wide by 8-foot wide and 12 to 14 inches deep. And we go bigger than that. So we bring in Little John Excavating to dig the basin with the backhoe, takes the soil away. The truck that delivers the rock hauls the soil away for free. Because we found if you just keep piling all the soil onto the pathway and make it taller and taller, it just melts back into the basin. So we use Catalina granite rock. We get it from Churchman Sand and Gravel because they're the cheapest supplier. But I like it because it's a surface rock you would naturally see out in the wild. I don't like stuff like Coronado Brown, which is an exploded rock mined from deep in the earth. All right, so this 1 year later looked like this after we put in the plantings. Here it is after the first storm. We did it in the cool months, so the plants we planted don't have the leaves, but you can look at it once it warmed up. So each one of these basins has an average capacity of 4,500 gallons. And the cost is $1,300 to $1,600 before the city rebate. But the city rebate will cut that cost in half. And the great thing about this is you now have water for life. Okay, and you're helping reducing flooding at the same time. So we get the neighbors to help plant this. So the contractors dig the basins, but volunteer neighbors plant it. So we get that community investment. They don't feel like, oh, that's the contractors or that's the city. No, that's all of ours. We all need to look out for it. Get all ages. The kids typically plant the wildflower seed along the perimeter. Thanks to Gary Masarnak and Wildlands Restoration, that's where we get our wildflower seed and whatnot. And so we plant 1 gallon understory plants, 5-gallon trees, and then we also plant seed in all of this. We plant in guilds. We used to just plant the tree, but now, as you can see, we plant the trees and the understory all at the same time. So that people only have to hand water to get stuff established once, not in a whole series of phases. So when I say we plant in a guild, we plant basically like a food forest. We've got the upper story, the mid story, the ground cover, and we're doing different root systems. So we're planting the deep tap rooted plants, the spreading roots, the tuber roots, like the coyote gourd is a fantastic one. Trying to take advantage of all ecological niches. And this then, the way we're planting all this, we're creating all these pockets of living nurseries, living seed banks. And when we are selecting what plants go where in the neighborhood, we will talk to that neighbor that wants the plantings and what they're more interested in. But we'll also look at what is missing on the block. And so we look for the species that aren't there on that block. They might be on the next block, but unfortunately, most of our neighbors don't walk more than a block. Okay, so they know their neighbors on their block, but not the next block. So we don't want them to have to walk further than a block. So we bring in those species. So we're trying to maximize the diversity of every block. And then in the monsoons, when we get a really good soaking rain, that's when we can dig up, keeping the root ball intact, of the seedlings coming up. In this case, it's a desert honeysuckle. And we can do a transplant with very high success rates. So we've got free plants in the neighborhood, okay? And then if it dries out right after that transplant, we do a supplementary irrigation, as you can see in the right-hand side photos, with 5-gallon or 3-gallon buckets, which you can get free from donut shops and bakeries at grocery stores. And we drill an 1/8-inch hole in the side and fill it with water and take it to the plant. Because it's just temporary, so we don't have to have the investment of a drip irrigation system. And then we write on there, irrigation bucket, please do not remove, because neighbors love to walk away with buckets if they don't realize it's got another purpose. If you want to curb that, you can also do irrigation. So I don't want to be arrested for public indecency, but urine is a great source of fertilizer and high nitrogen. So I will pee in the bucket after I filled it with rainwater from my rainwater tank, and I take it and put it on the plant. So my friend David Walker, he was riding through the neighborhood on a very hot day, And he saw one of my irrigation buckets. He's like, "Oh, thank God! Nice, this would be nice and refreshing." He didn't want to steal the bucket, but he just started splashing water on his face. He's like, "Is that pee? Damn that Brad!" Okay, so all right. So a neighbor made a comment. He said, "You know, I think there's more desert ironwood trees in our neighborhood than there are in the Ironwood National Monument." That is not true. I mean, what he said is it's true. He said that. But there are more ironwoods in the National Monument. He was just in a part of it where there weren't that many ironwoods. But it got us thinking. It's like, yeah, we should be part of the National Monument. We should be part of the National Park Service. We should be part of the National Forest. This should be a satellite. So then we talked to the University of Arizona Arboretum, Tanya Quist, the director, and we said, "Hey, could we get some plant identification signs like they have on campus? Could we be a satellite of the U of A Arboretum?" So we are now, our neighborhood forest is a satellite of the University of Arizona Arboretum. And we wanted to see if we could kind of push things a little more again. Okay, so the plant ID signs here on campus are bilingual. There's the Latin scientific name and there's the English common name. We said, well, let's go further. Let's also have the Spanish common name and let's also have the autumn common name. And so those are all on all ours. And then if you hit the QR code with your smartphone camera, it takes you to a page that tells you what's edible, what's medicinal, you know, all the various ethnobotanical uses of that plant. It gives you photos when it's in bloom, when it's in fruit, so you can learn a lot more. And this also harkens from the days when I was trying to get to know place and learn better. So I would have tons of plant books I'd carry around, but I'd also go to Tonopah Park, I'd go to the Tucson Botanical Gardens, I'd go to the Desert Museum, Superior Arboretum, and with my plant books, and I would not let myself look down at the plant ID signs. And I would just go, "I think you are," and then I'd look at the sign, "Oh, I didn't get it," or "I got it." Okay, but just that enabled me to quickly build my plant identification knowledge. Okay, so what I want to show you here in the right-hand image is here is my nephew and my sister-in-law living, walking along one of the paths. We are not allowed, or not supposed to, plant tall trees under the power lines. So we plant bush trees. So we plant desert hackberry, we plant the wolfberry, we plant jojoba, we plant creosote. So which bushes that can get 12 feet tall, especially with the harvested street runoff, provide shade, a canopy we can walk under, but won't interfere with the power lines. So there's always a way to get around seeming limitations that can be leverage bars. Here are some of the neighborhood kids and one of the neighborhood grandmothers harvesting the prickly pear fruit. So when we have our neighborhood prickly pear harvesting, we also do planting. We take cuttings from the plants and put them in. So we're planting future harvests at the same time. And here's a little gorilla planted desert ironwood tree planted from seed. That tree is now taller than me. We did that in the student housing complex parking lot where they weren't interested in planting trees. So like, "Oh, we'll plant it for you for free." Okay, you want to get away from this. This is oasis depleting, where I see this is oasis generating. This guy's literally vacuuming his yard and vacuuming all the leaf drop. Leaves are called leaves because we're supposed to leave them. So we find with these water harvesting basins, they're really great because everything moves with gravity, not just water. So the leaf drop, and we do cut up prunings. So, and when the leaves that have fallen on the street, they wash off the street into the street side basins if we got our elevations right. So we're finding the soil fertility is increasing over time. The soil porosity is increasing over time. And there were studies done by Mitch Pablo Zuckerman here at the U of A that found in street side basins, one that had a gravel and rock cover and another that had the organic matter cover. He found those that had the organic matter cover had twice as much soil moisture and twice the bioremediation ability and soil life that the non-organic mulched basins had. Okay, so this is our native soil in the upper left when we start. Then we make the basin, start adding free on-site organics, and that's what the soil looks like in about 3 to 4 years. Okay. Didn't buy a thing, not a single soil amendment. Okay. And then all that organic matter, especially the high carbon material, is great habitat for mycorrhizal fungi, which fuses with the roots of the photosynthesizing plants, thereby expanding the surface area of the plant's root network, and enabling a far greater amount of stormwater to be, or harvested water to be uptaken. So we got to collaborate with these other life forms. In some areas, we can't make a basin as large as we'd like. So bottom left, we would have loved to have made this basin even bigger, but couldn't because there's driveway, there's public path, and underground utilities. So we went deeper. We went additional 2 feet deeper. My nephew's standing on the vertical mulch. It can take his full body weight because we dug 2 feet deep and packed it full of coarse prunings from the neighborhood street trees. So it's very porous. Water quickly infiltrates. It's an incredible amount of high carbon organic matter. It's more habitat for the mycorrhizal fungi, and bioremediates toxins coming off the street, absorbs more water, get bigger tree. Win, win, win. It's also essential we have the human aspect. So there's more and more people are putting in walls and fences that we can't see the neighborhood house. We then lose that house. It's no longer friendly eyes on the street. So another part of our efforts is trying to encourage people to get rid of the solid wall. If you still want a fence, turn it into a fence, but make sure you can see through it so we can say hello to one another. And this makes the street safer because there's more friendly eyes on the street. We find a lot of folks will park on the public right-of-way, the public pathway, when we start creating, there's no water harvesting basins here, but when we start to create them there, that reduces the parking in the public pathway. Okay, but here we find people typically have too narrow a pathway, so only one person can walk down. You can't walk side by side. So we've been working with neighbors to widen the public pathways and to clear them of gravel. And so all of a sudden, mom and her kids and the dog can walk side by side, whereas before they couldn't. We're getting rid of these horse burial mounds that seem to be very popular throughout the West, and are a huge hindrance to the pedestrians. Now it's much easier to walk through. But that gravel is a real issue. So here you can see the little wagon. You can see the ruts that the wheels left in the gravel. So talking to my elderly neighbors, they said, we cannot walk on gravel. It's too painful on our feet. It's too difficult. I found that to be the case when my mom got older, and she came down with cancer, and in her latter months, she could not walk on this. And she also could not walk without us walking beside her. So it was great that we had more public paths in the neighborhood that we could walk side by side, as opposed to her being forced to walk in the street. We've been so successful with our plantings in the neighborhood that this can happen, where if it's not maintained, you can't freely walk through. You're having to duck everything. So now you cannot participate in our street side rain garden plantings unless you sign a one-page maintenance stewarding agreement, which we file with the permit, that states that you understand that you need to maintain a minimum 5-foot wide public pathway and a minimum 7-foot high clearance to maintain that public pathway. Because we want to make these paths convenient and joyous to use, so the maximum number of people walk through this and enjoy the forest, not hate it. Okay. Here's my nephew and his friend at a little neighborhood prickly pear lemonade stand with mesquite cookies. The kid makes bank because there's not much he has to buy in terms of ingredients. The bulk's being harvested in the neighborhood, and the neighborhood loves the story of all that too. I'm going to skip by this. We also, because I'm running short out of time, we were inspired by the Tenderloin National Forest. Do you guys know the Tenderloin District in San Francisco? It's a very urban neighborhood in San Francisco. I heard about these artists that they went into a dead-end alley, and it was all paved, They pickaxed a hole through the asphalt and planted a coastal redwood tree and then posted a sign that said Tenderloin National Forest. That coastal redwood tree is now 4 stories tall, and the 4-story apartment buildings around it, they have painted murals on the walls. They painted much more. It's this incredible oasis in the middle of a kind of vegetatively bleak neighborhood. They also stole the Park Service and National Forest Service graphics and started making maps of the Tenderloin district and what were the better hiking trails and other assets. And so we did the same thing. Inspired by them, we stole the graphics and made such a map for the Dunbar Spring neighborhood. And when you see these blue dots alongside the street, that signifies where there is an adjoining property that has from 1 to 12 street runoff harvesting basins. So each dot can represent from 1 to 12. And then when you see the blue circle in the middle of the street, that represents a water harvesting traffic circle. When you see the blue half moon, that represents a water harvesting chicane. There's some brown ones. Those were the ones that predated the water harvesting efforts in our neighborhood. So what we see with this is where we're doing good and other parts of the neighborhood where we need to do gooder. Okay, and so every few years we update the map to show us if we're doing good and where we need to do gooder. Okay, I'm almost about to wrap it up here. Something I find, all of this is ongoing cultural change. Okay, because we're always having to educate our neighbors on the value of a lot of the native plants and their various uses and whatnot to us and other life forms, and the advantage of planting the rain and so forth. But here, this is one of those curb extensions or chicanes in the street with native plantings. And this was taken just before we got our first decent rain in 2020. So that was the driest year on record. We only had 4 inches of rain. So you can see the native vegetation is showing its drought adaptation through its drought deciduous nature. So that is not going to be on the cover of any gardening magazine. But nothing's dead there. None of the perennials are dead. So 1 week after that good rain, this is what it looked like. And so it's really important that people realize, no, that's not a dead plant. That's a well-adapted plant to this climate and our pulses between dry and wet. Yeah, so there's a lot we got to do there, and we've had to do a lot of work with landscape companies. That's ongoing. They tend, all too often, the employees have very little to no plant identification training, especially with the native plants. And when they're sent out on a city call, they tend to, if they're told to remove litter, they clear cut everything. So they did that to a great deal of our public installations. So we started to create these phone trees with neighbors where anytime you see a landscape company out in the street, approach them immediately, ask them who sent them, get their phone number, call them, and call the rest of us on the phone tree so we can surround them in a nice way, and then ask them to leave, because we typically ask, why are you here? I said, we're here to clean up. What are you here to clean up? And they said this, just gesturing with their hand to everything in front of them. I said, well, what is that? Well, we're here to take those weeds. Where are the weeds? And they point to every tree and bush. I go, no, those aren't weeds. So for well over 10 years, we had no consistent ally within the city system. Thankfully now the city has the Storm to Shade Green Infrastructure Program. So that department, that program, we finally have some decent allies who we can call. And they've been doing a lot of work. They still need to do a lot of work, and working with different city departments to get them aware of the value of this. They now put little medallions on the curb that say, this is managed by City of Tucson Storm to Shade. Here's the phone number if you have any issues. But the Storm to Shade program is way under-resourced for the amount of green infrastructure installations in the city. So our neighborhood foresters, which we started long ago, we quickly realized we needed to have in-neighborhood maintenance crews that could care for all of this. So there would never be untrained maintenance crews sent in the first place. And we collaborate with Storm to Shade. We now help train their crews and their contractors, but they still don't have enough to do the work. So they depend on our neighborhood foresters to do the bulk of the maintenance, and they help be our backup. So I think it's really important when we're doing these rain and native food forest plantings that it's not just the planting. That's not the end of the work. That's the beginning. Okay, and it's all about how do we continue to educate people about the value of this and how do we care for it over time. So we have free hands-on pruning workshops and tree care workshops with arborists and many other things. And so here at the end, second to last slide, this is one of those water harvesting chicanes or pullouts with public art done by local artist Joseph Lupiani. And it's a sculpture of the Sonora suckerfish, which gets up to 14 inches long. Used to be very common in the Santa Cruz River when the Santa Cruz River flowed through Tucson. So it's a call back to what we lost. When we killed the Santa Cruz River, we killed the Sonora suckerfish running through downtown Tucson. But we can bring it back if we change the way we manage our water. So within the Sonora suckerfish is a horned lizard, because the horned lizard has adapted in these dry climates to harvest rainwater off its back. So when it rains, the horned lizard steps out into the rain, lifts its rear legs, so the slope of its back, its roof, slopes towards its head, and water travels through tiny gutters between the scales to the horned lizard's mouth. So how could we do the same or similar? In this case, the roof being our street, the roof being the sidewalk and the public right-of-way. How can we direct that to adjoining plantings to create the shaded food-bearing canopy over that to create a much more welcoming, inviting, joyous habitat for all of us? And then here's in the upper right, there's the spadefoots that appear every year. Now, this water harvesting is not ideal. It's not great habitat for the spadefoot because we design these to infiltrate water within 24 hours. Okay, so they don't have enough pool of water hanging out long enough to go from tadpole to adult. So you have to design a few strategically placed spadefoot habitat areas where water is going to linger longer. Okay, but we don't do that in the street in the public realm because we don't want city officials freaking out about mosquitoes. So we do that on private property. Okay, so finish as I began. Would you like to help collaborate with the True Living Oasis or oases? And if so, what is or will be your role? Because I think every one of us have a role in all our communities, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And then how might you stretch beyond your current level of ableness or comfort to invite and enable others to do the same? And what I'm going for with that last question is I find it's too easy just to keep doing what we do, to keep doing what we already know. And so what I was trying to show you throughout this talk is we have been continually evolving the way we plant in the neighborhood, the way we care for things, the way we do stuff. And that's work. You can get tired from that, but I find overall it's much more enlivening because it keeps it juicy, it keeps it dynamic, it doesn't get boring. So we're always looking for, well, how could this perform even better? How could we change the plant species? How could we change the way we plant? How could we change the way we're caring for it? So this will be even more vibrant and successful. And so that's always the open question, is how can we better evolve? And we're always asking that question of the natural world around us. How are you evolving to changing or fluctuating conditions? And what can you teach us? So that we've got cross-pollination of ideas and adaptations, because we are going to need that ever more with our changing climate. Okay. And if you'd like to get more information, I can't recommend enough these books. The Spanish edition I hope to have out by the end of the year. I've got them available tonight for deep discounted prices. You can get a deep discounted prices if you get direct from me at my website, harvestingrainwater.com. And at neighborhoodforesters.org, you can get a lot more information on our neighborhood forestry efforts, including templates you can freely use, like our maintenance agreements that we file with the permit, and how we do our annual planting projects. If you want to be a part of it, come to our plantings and stuff. If you want to be with us as we're talking to neighbors and knocking on doors, you can do that, because we're trying to create a template that other people can use and adapt. And I don't expect it to look exactly like our neighborhood, because every neighborhood's got its own drivers, passions, challenges. So I expect every neighborhood forest to have its own unique characteristic expressed. So thank you, and I don't know if there's any questions.
Question from online here, which is about how do you train your landscaping crews? What does that program sort of look like, your urban neighborhood landscaping crews?
Okay, so when we're training neighbors, we have more or less monthly stewarding parties. So we call it a party, but it's just get together and work. So so on a weekend, we'll meet for a couple hours, and then so we're teaching people plant identification. It's like, okay, here's how you prune in a way that's gonna help the plant's health, not make it worse. Don't leave the dead stubs and stuff. Here's how you can cut up that prunings into mulch. So we're just showing them our overall approaches. Then and we'll seed species that we want that aren't there. That's another thing we oftentimes do. And then, so that's not a contractor, that's just neighbors. But with the contractors, we do very similar stuff. So when a storm to shade hired contractor comes to the neighborhood, they'll meet with me and some of the others in our group, and then we go through plant identification. We say, okay, what are you wanting to do here? And I go, okay, we want to maintain it, and we're trying to shift them from an old paradigm of leave evidence of that we were here to, well, why don't you leave no evidence that you were here, but rather leave evidence of enhanced health. So let's remove the invasives and make more room for the natives. And let's prune out of the street. Let's prune away from the reflective bollards. Let's prune away from the signs, so the Department of Operations won't come and clear cut everything. We helped Storm to Shade create their handbook, which people can download for free off the Storm to Shade website. And then when we are hiring contractors, we can give much deeper education. In fact, we give them the specifications of the work. So we don't use Pima County or City of Tucson rain garden specifications. We do ones that I think are more dynamic and work better and have much more detail in them. Like they have the 3 planting zones, the bottom, terrace, and top, as opposed to just bottom and top. We have elevation relationships, so the inlets are never clogged. So that they become accustomed to that, and they don't have to read the plan when they go to the next neighborhood. They already know what's expected. And we're hovering like hawks to make sure they do it right. Yeah.
I have several questions. Did you begin your planting in Dunbar Springs in the really high rainy year?
So our first annual tree planting was in 1996.
Okay, so not so much.
Yeah.
And you said for 2 or 3 years you would do supplemental irrigation if we didn't get good rain. Okay.
Yeah. So we tell everyone to that should be their expectations. The first 1 to 3 years they'll need to irrigate depending on the weather.
Okay.
So if we get those real dry years, it's going to be 3, not 1.
Okay. Then how did you get people to accept cacti?
Sometimes because it is free. And then with a lot of our neighborhood events, like we used to have the mesquite milling for 15 years with the mesquite pancake breakfast and stuff. We had prickly pear syrup. So people taste it. It's like, what do you make this from? Well, we made it from the fruit of this cactus. You could have that growing right outside your house. And we're having a prickly pear harvesting processing workshop in August. Come to that. And so then the more people that get exposed to that, to neighbors that won't come to that, I will deliver a prickly pear beverage, have them try it. So there's all kinds of ways to, yeah, come
And you
in.
have a 20-foot right of way. In our neighborhood, we have 13 feet. That's
Yeah.
considerably less.
But it's awesome because that is
Is
so much
that-
more than so many other neighborhoods. Yeah, so we do have we have a number of streets in our neighborhood with just a 10-foot right of way, and that's more than enough because that way we can have a 5-foot wide basin on the street and a 5-foot wide path right on the property line. And we've been working with the city, like Brandon here, we've got in areas where it's a shorter right of way because you got a 10-foot right of way, right? So there we worked with the city, so we didn't have to do the pedestrian platform. I didn't highlight that in the talk, but usually the city requires there to be a 2-foot wide level area, level at the top of the curb. So if people are parallel parking and the passengers get out, they can step on that. But when we've got the smaller basins, basically we don't need to do that pedestrian platform, so you can come right to the curb.
And I think my last question, I'm embarrassed to admit this because I've known you for decades, but all of our street plantings were done incorrectly.
Oh.
And so we planted at ground level. Can
Oh.
those be retrofitted to your design?
Yeah, so I typically don't dig under the canopy of the plant. Okay, but if you dig beyond the drip edge, the roots are going to get it because Dr. Jimmy Tipton at the U of A did a study a number of years ago, finding the bulk of the water uptaken by our desert trees is uptaken to 3 times the diameter of the canopy of the tree. So I didn't include in this slideshow, but I have in my books. We don't do big, massive basins. We do basins all over the place. And then it's like telling the tree, here's the water, come and get it. So the roots grow out to it. And the basin closest to one tree, the trees further away, their roots are coming in too. So you can have basins all throughout the area or other water harvesting strategies, and the roots will find that water. Yeah.
So all is not lost.
No, definitely not.
We have another online question here, which is, you mentioned the spade foot, but how do you accommodate native animals as well as plants in this urbanized environment? i.e., what do you do to prevent these organisms from being harmed by humans or cars?
Yeah. Well, that's a big reason why we're doing the traffic calming. It's to make it safe for us and other life forms. And we're not done with the traffic calming in our neighborhood. We got to do a lot more. So we got a $100,000 Inflation Reduction Act funded grant to do more traffic calming, which we're hoping to get underway in the next month or so. And we've been working with the Ward 1. We're in Ward 1. Ward 1 office. Every ward office can do 5 speed humps per year at a subsidized price for different neighborhoods. So instead of costing you $10,000 for a speed hump, it's $500. So we're getting 2 of those this year. So even though it might be a number of years before you get qualify again, because they spread it around all the neighborhoods, you're just ready for the next one. A big thing was the way we did our water harvesting and tree planting in the public right-of-way. We got the vast majority of cars off the public pathways, which used to be the dominant pattern. My brother and I were guilty of it too. So now the majority of the cars park on the street. So we have that safer area off the street. And by getting more cars to park on the street, we narrow the street with cars slowing traffic. It used to, the wide streets seemed much wider because no one parked on the street. They all parked on the public walkway. They didn't know it was a walkway because we don't have sidewalks in our neighborhood. Thank goodness we don't have sidewalks, because that enabled us to make these more curvilinear earthen paths, and we don't have the same heat island effect that you do with all that concrete. The other thing they might be wondering about is like toxins coming off the road. So we find that the more organic matter stuff we have, I mentioned Mitch Baba Zuckerman's research finding the elevated levels of bioremediation we have in our organic matter mulch basins. So we, first off, we're not an auto repair shop. So there's nowhere near the fluids that you would find there on our neighborhood street. So you got to think of the context. And then we're, with all that bioremediation, we're lessening the toxins even more. And we've had no adverse effects on any of our plants with the street runoff.
Have you found, this is a personal question, a difference in survival or growth rates between trees that are planted as seed versus nursery stock?
Yeah, the seed is when we grow in situ, so in place, we place the seed and it grows there. Those are way better because the root's never been hemmed in. But when I say way better, all the nursery plants are doing fantastic. But we find there's an even greater drought tolerance of those that the roots are never hemmed in, and they tend to grow faster. Oh shoot, there was another thing I wanted to say on, it just disappeared. Maybe it'll come back.
Are there any other questions? in the room?
Yeah.
I had a question about organizing. How have you done, especially in the early days? And then also thank you for coming, and I really hope you enjoy your introverted time later today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I will. I can't say it's something I enjoy, it's just something I have to do. So, okay, so we've just been inventing it as we go. And that's why we put so much resources on the website so that you don't have to start from scratch. But I was real lucky in the early years when we did our first annual tree planting. The Tucson Urban League, Marilyn Robinson and Dorothy, I forget Dorothy's last name, they were in our neighborhood. They had an office in our neighborhood and they were helping us a lot. So they let me use their computer to write the grant and they helped me find a grant to apply for. So we got a $1,000 grant that first year from the State Forestry Department to subsidize the price of our trees. And then they also were great. They said, well, why don't you collaborate with others? TEP's got a massive substation in your neighborhood. Why don't you get them to come out with their telephone pole auger trucks and pre-dig your holes? So we did, and it was phenomenal. So had all these massive trucks boring these holes 3 feet deep, right through the caliche, and then people would follow up and shape the basin and plant the tree. Way easier to dig. There's no way we could have planted 200 trees with volunteer labor in the soils that we have in our neighborhood. But thanks to that, it made it much easier. And it got super exciting because the auger trucks worked, and then they'd take off, go down the block and start working there. And all of a sudden we'd hear the sirens and the cops are whipping through the neighborhood, and then the fire department shows up and we're like, what the hell is going on? And they're hitting gas lines left and right. But because our neighborhood is an historic neighborhood, so many of the abandoned gas lines aren't on maps and they're not marked. So they didn't hit any live gas lines, but they're hitting abandoned gas lines left and right, and so they immediately have to, ribbon off the area and check to see if it's live or whatnot. So everyone's just like, my God, this neighborhood's intense. And, so yeah, it worked well. Oh, and so I like to say it takes nothing more than 2 people, 1 shovel, and 1 tree to start a community tree planting project. 2 people, that's community. And you just keep going. So we've planted over 1,800 trees in our neighborhood since 1996, thousands of understory plants, and we planted over 1 million gallons of stormwater per year in the neighborhood. And we just keep going. And if we didn't, it would atrophy because there's always tree loss to storm damage, to people running over it, to new person moves to the neighborhood, doesn't understand the value of it, cuts it down or has someone cut it down. So we're always working to keep ahead of the mortality. And thankfully, because we've been doing it for so long, and especially since we've got all these spongy water harvesting areas, now we're finding that stormwater flow, wildlife like birds pooping, um, animals going through are planting ever more and more seed. So now we'll go to a downstream area, the next block, and go, where'd this slender genusia vine come from? We didn't plant any here. Where'd this tuberosa come? Nobody planted this here. Wait a minute, all of a sudden we've got ironwood tree seedlings. We haven't planted those on this block yet. And it's all coming from the seed upstream or upwind, wind and so forth. So it's gotten to that point that it's getting to one of our goals is to create a beneficial ruin so we can walk away or die away. And this will continue to evolve and thrive without us because we've created these passive systems that work with gravity.
I've got 3 questions.
Okay.
I noticed in your images, you had both foothill palo verdes and blue palo verdes.
Yeah.
And those are 2 very different species.
Yeah.
Could you comment on the relative strengths that you found on each of those species as to where you're positioning them? And what are they bringing to the party?
Yeah. So first off, they bloom and seed about 3 weeks apart from one another. So we extend the harvest of both the edible flowers and the edible seed. And then we plant the foothills palo verde in our drier areas, and we plant the blue palo verde in our wetter, colder areas.
Okay, good.
And the other thing is, I didn't mention this in the talk, is we are always looking for coppice species. And what I mean by that, so around the world, people would cut a branch of a tree but not kill the tree, and then the branch eventually grows back. So it's a way, how do you harvest its lumber and other things? And what species are better adapted to that? Can they deal with that without dying out? We find the foothills palo verde is not well adapted to coppicing,
Right.
but the blue palo verde is. But not as well adapted as the desert ironwood,
Right.
Or the velvet mesquite. They're even better. So where we are looking to do a planting where we don't have as much collaboration as we'd like with adjoining residents, and there's a very high likelihood that that planting is going to be abused or even cut down, because we've got a couple tree killers in our neighborhood. I won't go more into that, but maybe get the idea. Those trees will regrow from the stump, and they outlive the tree killers. So when we're looking as to what species we plant, we're taking into mind of how friendly an environment is this, or do we need something that's going to be able to recover from some damage?
Then the next point is desert ironwood. In my HOA over the years, I've been discreetly bringing in more and more desert ironwoods to replace the non-native mesquites
Yeah.
that typically lift driveways and get into sewage lines and all sorts of nasty things. And I have to say, we have never seen a desert ironwood, even a big one, planted too close to a house, lift a driveway, a sidewalk, or get into sewage. Now, I don't know, if I'm just seeing things, but has that been your experience too?
So far, yes. Never say never, but so far, yes, that's been my experience.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
And then the next point is, I have a sister that lives up here on 8th Street, and they have chicanes, 8th, 9th, and 10th. And one of the big issues is that Bermuda grass seed and Bermuda grass propagules float. And with these big storms, they are constantly invading the chicanes
Mhm.
and then the run-up areas.
Mhm.
Have you found effective ways to mitigate, constant infestation of Bermuda grass and other invasives?
Yes. So on property, chickens are the best thing. They
What's
love chickens. They love Bermuda
Oh,
grass.
chickens.
Yeah. So as soon as it comes up, they eat it. And but you can't do that in the public right of way because other things eat chickens. So if you want to go the non-toxic method and you're willing to be on top of it, just hand pulling has worked great. So I can do that on my block, but I'm unwilling to do that on a block on the other side of the neighborhood. That's got to be the responsibility of those neighbors. And if they're not willing, okay, then we go into the toxins. So then we'll do strategic applications of herbicide. So we do that when it's just coming up, and we hit it hard. If there's an area that's got abundant Bermuda grass growth, we will weed whack it, we'll cut it all down, we'll pull out that organic matter. So there's a minimum amount of Bermuda grass there. And then as soon as it starts sending out its growth, we hit it with the herbicide, it pulls it down. And then typically after one application, not more than two, it's knocked back enough that it's really easy to do the hand pulling after that. And but there's another piece is this is also why we don't just plant trees now, but we plant the understory plantings at the same time. We want to get the perennials that'll outcompete and shade out those areas.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we've hit 8:30, so I'm gonna put the kibosh on it.
Yeah.
Hopefully you'll stick around, answer questions and sell books, and
Yeah.
thank you all for being here today. Appreciate you.
Yeah. Opportunity to.
Thanks so much. That was really great.
You bet. Also have that.
Yes.
Bell.